Coming to you from the West Coast, this is PolitiCoast. Today is December 14th, 2017, and this is episode 66. PolitiCoast is the number one BC politics podcast that occasionally gets distracted by what's happening in Ottawa. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PolitiCoastPod, and support the show at patreon.com/PolitiCoast.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. And this week, we also have in the studio...
Micah, what up?
Number one most appearing guest now.
Yeah, I have officially rubbed that in the face of both Dr. Lindsay Teds and David Moskrop.
Dr. David Moskrop. He got his PhD.
Oh,
I believe.
Sorry, Dave.
As always, we have to thank our premier sponsors, Lindsay Teds and Blake Hodson, for helping make the show possible. Before we get into today's show, which is going to be a big show as we're talking about the dam decision on Site C with Dan Woynillowicz from Clean Energy Canada, and we have an extended interview that we've already recorded with you, Micah, on the Chief Justice and the Comeau case. But before that, I want to make a couple quick notes. We've done some recent appearances. Scott and I spoke with the crew from Left at the Valley. They're an atheist/skeptic podcast from up the highway in the Fraser Valley. And I did a deep dive this past weekend, and I don't think it's online yet, with a podcast called This Week in News with Kevin and Benedict. They self-describe themselves on their Facebook page as two atheist SJW cucks preaching libtard lies from our coastal elitist ivory towers. So I guess I gave the Canadian SJW cuck perspective, and that should
Who talks like that?
That should be on their feed soon. People who are self-deprecating. We'll put links to those shows in our show notes or on our social media as soon as they're available.
Idiots talk like that.
And one final note, the Patreon changes are not happening. They announced yesterday, I believe, they're strapping their plan to give you guys a bunch of new service charges. So
we'll keep eating those, basically.
Yeah, so all your complaining paid off.
Yeah. First up, segment one, Horgan's big dam decision.
We're joined by Dan Woynillowicz, Policy Director for Clean Energy Canada, based at SFU, and author of a Vancouver Sun editorial about Site C, with or without Site C, the future of BC's electric. So Dan, why don't you introduce yourself and explain what Clean Energy Canada is?
Great. Well, I'm glad to join you guys. Clean Energy Canada is a think tank based at Simon Fraser University at the Morris J. Wask Centre for Dialogue. And our focus is on looking at climate and energy policy in Canada and how we can transition to a low-carbon economy. So we do a mix of research and convening and commentary like this.
So John Horgan earlier this week, Monday morning, announced that the province is going ahead with the Site C dam. What was your initial reaction to that news?
It was really clear how difficult it was for the Premier and his cabinet and his entire government to arrive at this decision. I can't say that I was surprised, but I would have been equally unsurprised had they decided not to proceed with Site C. I mean, we had kind of reached this point of peak Site C where there were two extremely polarized camps. It was clear that no matter what the decision, there was going to be a very vocal group that would oppose the decision and be very upset about it. And so really, I'm just glad that we actually got to this decision. And now we can look ahead to what's next, because I actually think that the decision itself is actually the precursor to a number of other decisions this government is going to have to take that flow from it, as opposed to being a final decision that now we can just move on from.
So what are those other decisions that naturally follow from this?
Well, there are a few. One area is, of course, reconciliation with First Nations, and the Premier spoke to that. And obviously we've heard from First Nations, both those that are very upset about the decision, as well as some of those that had signed benefit agreements and are pleased that the project is proceeding and that those benefits will flow to their communities. So that's an area that I think the government obviously needs to engage on, to follow through on the commitments they've made to First Nations and to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and implementing that. But that's not my area of policy expertise. What we're really focused on is, what does BC's energy system look like? And one of the things that the energy minister had been mandated with in her mandate letter from the Premier is to develop an energy roadmap for the province, to do a review of BC Hydro, to have BC Hydro develop a new integrated resource plan, which is going to look at what is the supply and demand scenario. And ultimately, I think when you put those pieces together, as well as the new climate change strategy with which Minister Heyman is tasked with developing, and really then that is going to lead to some pretty big changes in terms of how we approach energy in the province, how we approach climate change. And ultimately, I think part and parcel of that is how can we actually derive the most value out of Site C for British Columbians, both economically and environmentally.
So the Premier's arguments around, or at least the justifications he gave on Monday, were around more the economics, it sounded like to me. Should we take on the debt and have to raise taxes and make the province unaffordable and not do everything we want, or should we just power through with the sunk cost? And let's not call it a sunk cost, because I know Stephen Tweedale will get mad at me on Twitter. But as you said, your specialty is around the energy demands. And like you said in the Vancouver Sun, the future is electric. So I think one of the things the Utilities Commission was envisioning, if we didn't go towards Site C, is that we could do a similar amount of electricity with wind and solar and other types of renewables. Well, maybe let's put it this way. So the BC Utilities Commission was sharply critical of the BC Hydro forecasts for how much electricity that we would need. Did you think that report was justified in making that? Because I got the sense from your articles and your comments since then that we need a lot more electricity.
Yeah, I think that the BC Utilities Commission, in certain respects, they had their hands tied by the fact that, they were tasked with looking at what demand could evolve to become if we just look at everything as it is today in terms of government policies and programs that are going to have any kind of a bearing on how much electricity we use. Now, what we've argued is that when you look at the NDP's agenda, and particularly their commitments on climate change, and then you look at how they would fulfill those commitments, all the modeling that's been done by universities, by independent researchers, shows that to address climate change, one of the key tools is something called electrification, which is fuel switching from using fossil fuels to fuel our vehicles, to power our homes, to heat buildings, to provide energy to various industrial operations, to switch from fossil fuels to electricity. You get a lot of greenhouse gas emission reductions with that. So the BC NDP in their platform, they committed to a fairly aggressive target for 2030, as well as recommitting to BC's 2050 target for reducing emissions. The only way we hit those targets is if we increasingly rely on electricity. And so in that scenario, that takes us actually into the high demand scenario that the BC Utilities Commission did look at, but rejected as being a future that was inconsistent with the policies as they are today. But if this government follows through on their platform and their commitment to those targets, then that actually will create demand for electricity, and we will end up in that higher demand scenario. And that was a point that we really felt was important to make, because we would be in a troublesome situation in the province had Site C been rejected on the premise that we don't need electricity, when the reality is we very much do. And so in that instance, then you can look at what are the different options for how we get that electricity.
So if we are going for a cleaner energy system, hydro is generally being pitched as something that's fairly clean as far as greenhouse gases go, although Big Concrete Dam does generate a lot of CO2 just from the concrete itself, and as well as some of the lost habitat and green areas. So where does this fit related to other potential sources of electricity?
Well, with hydro, it's fairly comparable to some of the other renewable energy technologies that we might otherwise use, like wind or solar. For any form of electricity generation, you have to look at the life cycle emissions. Everything that goes into manufacturing parts or providing concrete or steel, getting it onto site, constructing it, and then operating it. And in that regard, hydro does have slightly higher greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis than wind or solar, but marginally so. I think the other important thing to acknowledge is that hydro compared to wind and solar. It provides a different value of electricity insofar as you have it on demand when you need it. It's what people refer to as dispatchable. And that is a higher value form of electricity, because sometimes we need to keep the lights on, and so if the wind stops blowing, you need to have something else that can kick on. Ultimately, wind, solar, those are very complementary to hydro. If you put all those together, you can have a very effective system. So, from an environmental perspective, you can kind of slice and dice it in different ways. Site C has a large environmental footprint, but it's all in one place, and you can have one transmission corridor taking the power from it. Whereas, so in a sense, you centralize the impacts versus having them distributed over a lot more valleys and rivers and parts of the province, and perhaps more transmission. So it can be fairly challenging to actually do a straight up assessment of those impacts, particularly when Site C is so large that if you were going to use wind or solar instead, you'd have quite a few projects. And so where are they going to be? What's the impact going to be? It's hard to do an apples to apples comparison.
So I saw the argument put forward that technology will catch up sooner rather than later on the intermittency issue. Do you think that's a realistic way to address that, or does that baseload power still matter going forward for the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, it isn't the baseload power we need necessarily. It really is just the dispatchable power, the power that you have on standby. If you have enough wind, solar, run-of-river hydro, if you start getting into marine power, geothermal, if you have a diversity of supply, you can have the same effect as baseload power, which has traditionally been, a big dam or a nuclear facility or a coal-fired power station. You can get that same electricity. It's really more your management of the supply and keeping the grid stable and making sure you have power all the time when you need it. And so that's where technologies are emerging, batteries and other forms of energy storage that can pair nicely with those variable sources like wind and solar. In a province like British Columbia, though, both with our existing hydro, but also with the prospect of Site C, those hydro reservoirs effectively act as big batteries because you can flip a switch and you can have them generating power as you need it. So in the British Columbia context, we actually have the energy storage we need to be able to have wind and solar resources on the grid as well.
One of the things you mentioned in the last question was talking about transmission of different projects. I know other governments have talked about the need to modernize the electrical grid. Do you know what the state of BC's electrical grid is? And one of the things in the NDP leadership race, Jagmeet Singh talked about was developing like a super grid across the country. Do we have a good enough grid to sell at least to Alberta from Site C if we have extra energy, to the States? How good are our wires, basically?
They could stand to be improved, both in terms of the age of the existing transmission infrastructure. It's not operating at its full capacity because it's old. It needs to be upgraded. So you can achieve a certain amount just by replacing what's there. But there is some discussion about increasing transmission capacity, particular to Alberta. The federal government has initiated a study that both provinces are participating in, looking at what the benefits would be in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Alberta if there were more clean electricity from BC going onto the Alberta grid, so that as they phase out their coal-fired power, perhaps instead of building a lot of natural gas-fired power, they'd be able to rely on hydro from BC to complement some of the wind and solar that's going to be built in Alberta. So there is definitely some potential there. Alberta does have a different electricity system in that it's a competitive market-based system. So in order for BC Hydro to sell into Alberta, they'd have to be able to compete with supply in Alberta on a cost basis. And so again, until we actually have Site C up and running and know what the costs are, we won't have a sense of what kind of value they need to be receiving and whether that's something that would be competitive in the Alberta marketplace.
So most of BC lives kind of in one corner and the dam is in the far corner, the opposite side. Is the transmission that far away going to run into significant losses, and does that kind of negate some of the benefits of Site C?
No, the transmission line losses have been reduced. We've got better transmission lines now, so you can minimize those line losses. I think the reality is that both the previous government and this government are hopeful that there is going to be quite a bit of industrial activity in the northern part of the province, whether it's using the electricity to power some of the natural gas fields in the northeast, or else mining operations throughout the north, or else industrial activity on the west coast. So, quite a bit of that demand is likely to just be in the north. But of course, there is going to be growth in demand in the south as well, both from population growth and economic activity. But also, if we do in fact begin to use electricity to power more vehicles on the road, to use for heat in buildings, so there definitely will be electrons flowing from north to south.
We mentioned Alberta, and one of the things announced today, and we were talking about Alberta, is this announcement in Alberta of wind farms being put up, and that they announced 4 production sites at least what Blake Schaefer from, I think, University of Calgary said was a pretty remarkable price of $37 per megawatt hour to build these. Do you know anything about that project or how it's going along?
Yeah, we've certainly been paying attention to what's going on in Alberta, and it's a great news story for Alberta to have had those projects come in at those low prices. I mean, it's actually competitive with the cost of building new natural gas. So for those Albertans who may have been concerned that there needed to be all kinds of subsidies going to renewable energy development in Alberta, I think what we've seen from those companies with the projects they put forward and the price point they're at is renewables are ready for prime time and can compete. So it's definitely a good news story for Alberta.
Well, the only other question I have is, what would you name Site C when it's done?
That's a good question. I'll leave that to the premier of the day to decide, and I suppose at that point they're going to have to decide whether Site C is a positive legacy to reward somebody, or whether it's a more challenging legacy, and they want to attribute a name to it that perhaps punishes that person. So we'll have to wait and see how things play out over the next few decades before that decision's made.
That's a pretty good political answer. I think that's the same one John Horgan gave when asked if he'd named it after Christy Clark at the press conference.
He must be getting good advice.
Yeah. Well, maybe just finish off by telling people where they can find Clean Energy Canada, where they can find you on the internet, and give yourself a plug.
Great. Well, you can find us at cleanenergycanada.org or on Twitter at cleanenergycan. And we actually have a weekly newsletter called the Clean Energy Review, which just lands in your inbox on Monday morning with the top 10 things that are making the news, pieces of insight, novel research from in Canada and around the world on clean energy and climate change, technology, policy, politics. It's a good quick read just to stay abreast in a field that's moving very quickly.
All right. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, great show.
So aside from Dan's thoughts on the energy calculations, and Clean Energy Canada, as he mentioned, is a nonpartisan institute, so he can't really get into the partisan politics thinking around Site C, but I think it's worth maybe us diving in for a couple minutes at least on that angle. I think we all watched John Horgan's press conference on Monday, or at least you and I did, Scott, and it was interesting because it was the most emotional I've seen Horgan. He came out there and was talking like he had to announce that he was killing the family dog.
Yeah, Minister Michelle Mundell looked like she was at a funeral. It was, unpleasant for them from the looks of it.
And so he pitches the arguments of, if we cancel this, rates will have to go up immediately for everyone, and we can't do other major infrastructure projects, and it kills our credit rating, and therefore we have to go ahead with this. He talked about how he had deep personal disagreements, and I get full sincerity from him on this, that he had deep disagreements with people in caucus, people in cabinet, friends and family. And later in questions, he mentioned that I think his wife and brother strongly disagreed with him on this. And it was at that point that I thought he was like almost about to tear up on how emotional he was getting on this, which is powerful and sort of goes to John Horgan's almost charm as a sincere politician. So I felt really bad for him watching it. Did you buy the economic argument they pitched?
Well, on one hand, sunk costs shouldn't ever be the sort of thing you base a decision on. And I don't know, it was one of those things. Site C for me has always been kind of sits in one hand, half dozen in the other, where it's you change the forecast slightly one way or the other. It made sense. Doesn't make sense. So I'm not sure I really have a huge amount to weigh in on whether or not John Horgan nailed the economic arguments on that one, but there was enough leeway in the BC Utilities Commission report that he had a plausible case, even if they weren't super thrilled with it, for going ahead.
The other thing that I think was roughest in his press conferences when he was asked about the Indigenous question and the people who felt like this violated UNDRIP. And his response was, I won't be the first premier in 150 years to disappoint Indigenous people. And he went on to try to say he's trying to do better elsewhere, at least. But it did sort of scream of, I was the one who said I'd be better. And then I just turned around and did this. And I know a lot of people, Andrew Weaver among them, were screaming bloody murder over this. And that brings me to Andrew Weaver's weird moment this week when he went on a radio show to claim that he was in a meeting with the mayor of Fort St. John, Lisa Ackerman, I think. And he said in this meeting that John Horgan, who was there, promised that Site C would not be built. And Weaver said, oh, this was like in June, only a couple months ago. And then that story comes out. So clearly John Horgan had it rigged to build this dam all along. As soon as he became premier, he was like, all right, building Site C. And then Lisa Ackerman, the mayor, goes on Twitter and says, that's false. We met a couple years ago when you, Andrew Weaver, were for this dam. To which Andrew Weaver then went, oh, sorry, my bad, publicly on Twitter, and basically was the one coming out with egg on his face.
Yeah, it wasn't a good look, and the Green Party's evolution on this has been interesting. Were initially at least somewhat supportive of it, or not full-on anti-Site C the way they are now, and guess the politics changed there.
Maybe while we have you here in studio, Micah, one of the things that's going to be happening almost instantly, I think even on Monday, some Indigenous tribes were announcing lawsuits against Site C. You obviously haven't read up on any of these and won't feel at all qualified to comment, but do you think that will do anything other than just slow the project down?
I mean, it's tough for me to answer that because my expertise is not in First Nations laws, as I'm sure you'll respect. But look, if you have groups that want to file petitions or file notices of civil claim, probably petitions to slow down the development of the project, there are obligations, right, that the Supreme Court of Canada has described that governments need to ensure that they meet in order to have these projects go ahead. I can't advise on what the status of whether the British Columbia provincial government has met those requirements or not, but that is the underlying factor here of what they're what First Nation groups will be seeking to do. Now, obviously, I can't comment on what their overall goals are, but to my understanding, this project has been underway for a long time, which to me tells me that at least some of the requirements have been met if they're this far along. So I can't comment on what the utility of those lawsuits are, but I know from a political perspective, as you mentioned, Bush, often these suits are launched to try and hold up, but you have to get an injunction to slow these things down, and they're going to have to prove irreparable harm. I don't know how they're going to do that.
Yeah, so the planning for this actually started in the 80s, and construction's been underway 2 years. So it's the sort of thing that you'd expect the lawsuits would have already been done. And when you're 2 years into construction and several million tons of concrete are already in the ground, it's probably an uphill battle to get anything enjoined at this point, I'm guessing.
Yeah, we're far along the process now.
Well, the last thing I have to talk about with the dam, and this is what we finished off with Dan, is what should we name this dam when it's finally finished? We actually did put this out on Twitter, and Jordan Carlson was saying Dammy McDamface. He claimed the awesome, easy, obvious answer. I had thrown out the dam that holds back John Horgan's tears. That or Reconciliation Dam, just as another punch in the gut for that claim. But either you have any other dam names?
Sunk costs.
Oh. The Christy Clark Dam, are we going with that?
The Christy Clark Dam of Fiscal Responsibility.
Can we name it after Lindsay Teds at this point? What can't we name after Lindsay Teds?
All right, well, the Green Party has said this won't be the straw that breaks their supply and confidence agreement, so the dam's going ahead, and John Horgan's now going to have to face the ire of the environmental base, at least.
Yeah, this dam is not popular in kind of the lower mainland, or I guess all of southwest BC, more or less. So it's, going to be a rough little patch for him. But the election, in theory, is 4 years away, so there's time to ride it out.
Moving on to segment 2, Chief Justice of the Beer Court. We're joined here with friend of the pod, Micah, once more to talk Supreme Court of Canada and beer this time.
Gentlemen, thank you again for having me on the program. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Comeau decision, which was heard not too long ago now. As a lead-off, we should just note that this whole conversation is about trade barriers and what a province can regulate itself to do. If that sounds at all appealing to you, my congratulations, and please listen on. If not, feel free to fast forward ahead to something likely far more interesting than this. But this decision, in my view, is one of the decisions of the year to keep your eyes on. This one, and probably Trinity Western, just in terms of the implication for the country. Okay, so by way of introduction, Comeau is a hero. So this guy is in New Brunswick, okay, and he goes into Quebec, Pointe-à-la-Croix, and buys like 354 bottles or cans of beer and a couple bottles of liquor because it's way cheaper in Quebec than in New Brunswick. And he rolls back into New Brunswick.
And we looked this up. It was like Sleeman's and Budweiser and Miller Genuine
I don't like to focus on that part because I think it takes away from the legend of Comeau.
We were thinking of drinking that tonight, and then I was like, no. He drinks crap beer. Let's get some good West Coast
we're in
stuff.
Vancouver, so I don't know what they're drinking in Quebec. I make no judgment.
Or New Brunswick.
Or New Brunswick, I guess. Okay, so fast forward ahead. He buys his beer, he rolls back into New Brunswick, and he gets pulled over by the RCMP. And it turns out they've had a sting operation on this guy because he's done this so many times before. And there's a regulation in New Brunswick that, and I'll oversimplify here, if you're going to buy liquor with certain exceptions, you have to buy it from the corporation basically being the government, an equivalent of the LCBO in New Brunswick.
Yeah, it's all public liquor stores there.
Exactly. Anyway, the RCMP write him up. They take all of his beer, obviously. I don't know what they're going to do with it, but probably have a sweet party. And then they write him up a ticket, which is for like, I can't remember, but
I think it was $300
it's
and
like
change.
$200 or $300 or something. They sent him on his way. Comeau's not very happy about this. He's probably spent a lot of money on the beer. So he decides to challenge this. And he finds very competent counsel. I think even at trial, he had Toronto counsel. And Comeau's lawyer goes into the trial decision and makes some arguments to say that this regulation that New Brunswick has restricting the purchase of beer from anywhere outside of the province is ultra vires or outside the jurisdiction of the province. And I'm going to explain exactly how that works in a second. But here's the critical point. The trial judge buys the argument, okay? Buys it. And says to the New Brunswick Attorney General, like, sorry, bud, this law is no longer of force and effect. Comeau, you don't have to pay your ticket. I don't know what happened to the beer. But judgment in favor of Comeau, okay? Then this decision is appealed to the Court of Appeal of New Brunswick, and they decline to hear it. Now, normally, I'm just going to talk about procedure for 1 second here, even though this is so boring for all the other law nerds out there. Procedurally, I didn't even know that you were able to appeal the decision not to hear a judgment or an appeal of a decision, rather, all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is news to me. Anyway, the Supreme Court of Canada decides to hear it. And as those of you who have any awareness of the Supreme Court of Canada will know, the SCC will only hear matters if they deem it of national importance. So obviously there's something going on here. This is a very long-winded introduction into the facts because from here on out, we are getting into the nitty-gritty of division of powers, okay? Let's talk about trade barriers for 1 second. There's several forms of trade barriers. There's provincial marketing boards. There's mandatory sale requirements. There's prohibition of out-of-province purchases, repackaging requirements. I could go on and on. This decision is about the intersection of free trade within provinces and provincial regulatory power. You have, on the one hand, the provinces who want to be able to regulate what happens within their borders. And on the other hand, you have free market interests. If I want to have a truck carry Sleemans from Quebec to British Columbia, should I be able to do that? Or should I only be able to buy Sleemans from a BC liquor store or someone who has a certificate from the British Columbia government to make those kinds of sales? The section of the Constitution which is of relevance here and which is coming under scrutiny is section 121. I'm going to read it out verbatim here. It says, all articles of growth, produce, or manufacture of any one of the provinces shall, from and after the Union, be admitted free into each of the other provinces. This is part of the Constitution Act 1867, which is our first Constitution Act. We have another one, which was passed in 1982.
The Charter, yeah.
The Charter
is part of
stuff.
it, yeah.
Yeah, and stuff. Charter is a schedule to that. And so Comeau essentially is arguing that 121, if you look at the language
in the originalist fashion,
to me, reading that, it sounds like, okay, it's pretty clear. You get to buy something from another province and take it home.
Be admitted free into each of the other provinces. Okay, so
why isn't that the case?
Let's take you back to 1920, Gold Seal. And this is going to illuminate why Comeau, is looking at a steep uphill climb at the Supreme Court of Canada. Spoiler alert, by the way. Uphill climb. In Gold Seal, which was, shocker, also about prohibition of alcohol sales, the Supreme Court of Canada decided in 1921 that a province could effectively regulate what was going on in its own borders so long as they were not applying tariffs. That's a very broad oversimplification, but at the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. So as long as you're not putting a tariff on other provinces' goods, you're fine. Anything that incidentally does that, the court says, okay, we're good with that. And then there's a test that starts. So this Gold Seal decision is picked up and a test is applied called the purpose and effect test. And so the question here is, what is the purpose of the impugned regulation? Is it to regulate what's going on within the province pursuant to section 9192 of the charter? Or are they doing something outside of that? And if the effect is to do something outside of that, is there some higher purpose that goes to a legitimate exercise of provincial power?
It's a sort of Section 1 type analysis. Is it reasonable-ish? But
kind of. And the reason
it's not exact.
The reason I say kind of will become relevant in a moment.
Okay.
But sort of the effect, I think, of that test, as Justice Brown picks up in his questions during the hearing, because you'll know that no reasons have been decided yet, right? It's just been heard. So Justice Brown is saying, like, okay, well, let's really look at this test. Is there really any point to Section 121? And this comes out after the Crown gets up, starts making passionate submissions about democratic principles and federalism and constitutionalism. These arguments are really striking a chord with a lot of the judges. The Attorney General of New Brunswick, who's the appellant in this case, doesn't really get that many tough questions from the justices. Like I said, the toughest one comes from Justice Brown, who almost challenges not just the Attorney General of New Brunswick, but also all of the intervening parties, specifically the Attorneys General, to think of one circumstance in which Section 121 would be violated and Sections 91 and 92 would not also be violated, effectively asking, is there any point to having Section 121 as this precedent has rolled along?
So 91 and 92 are?
Those sections really define the powers of each jurisdiction, the federal government and the provincial government. So they set out this division of power. Just to summarize the Crown position really quickly, I talked about these three principles. So they say the principle of federalism is enshrined in Sections 91 and 92 of the Constitution. And to oversimplify, the courts have found that political power is shared by two orders of government, the federal and the provincial. The effect of what Comeau is looking to do and what the trial judge did is stripping away some of this power, right? Because now you have certain areas of regulation that the provinces cannot get into. And the second principle is democracy. This can more or less be summarized that, it's going to be judges who decide whether regulation is worthy or not. And they will be making value decisions. Not that they don't do this all the time, mind you, but this really is a value call on the part of the judges, similar to the Oakes test, right? Even more similar to the Oakes test than the purpose and effect test. And finally, the principle of constitutionalism is more or less just like things should be certain in a self-governed nation, and Comeau's looking to make things a lot more unpredictable. Comeau's decision is, to counter this, by the way, is more or less like, this is nothing new in terms of restricting 91, 92. Comeau's counsel gives several different examples of ways that federalism is restrained, including the charter, and changes to the Senate, which were discussed in the Senate reference. Before Comeau goes up there, before Comeau's counsel gets up there to make these submissions, even though these are the guesses of the other justices of what they're going to hear, all of the attorneys general in the country, save for Manitoba, are more or less on board with Gold Seal for obvious reasons. This is how they're making money. And
everyone has their fiefdom.
They say that they have a higher purpose here, which is either A, to fund services of the provincial government, healthcare comes to mind, or B, the Attorney General of Canada representing the territories went up and had a very interesting argument, which was that the higher purpose here is actually more health related, that alcoholism in the territories is very serious and that restricting it is very important to achieve these health goals, which I actually thought that was a very interesting way to spin the higher purpose argument.
Well, it's a sort of temperance argument, and we've heard that throughout the decades, but even when we discuss at the provincial level whether or not to sell beer in private liquor stores or not, the moral panic kind of comes up, like, oh, everyone's going to get drunk on the street because we loosened the liquor laws a little. So, which isn't to say there isn't a legitimate
you can see
government
that
issue,
this
but it
is
can
this is you're asking about values,
yeah,
and is this a conversation judges should be having, or is this a conversation that the provinces should, or excuse me, that a democracy should be having? This is the point of Justice Brown, and then Justice Rowe starts sympathizing with this view. The other thing that Justice Rowe brought up that I thought was pretty interesting is an argument looking at the context of Section 121. You could see during the submissions that Justices Rowe and Brown, who are, by the way, on opposite ends of the courtroom, are just going back and forth with counsel, seem to take issue with whether Section 121 should even exist anymore, as I said. Now, Justice Rowe came from the perspective that if you look at Section 122, which is about international trade regulations, that section is temporary in nature. Okay, and what Justice Rowe takes from that is, if you take that context, it's possible that Section 121 was also supposed to be temporary. When the three colonies came together in 1867, right, it's possible that these sections were only supposed to be around until the Dominion could figure out what they were going to do with respect to these policies.
Little did they know, Canadians have no ability to amend constitutions ever. We got one new constitution. We're done.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a separate episode.
Okay, so only Alberta's Attorney General proposes an alternative to this purpose and effect test. And I'm not going to get into that so much, only to make a point from a political perspective that I found it pretty interesting that Alberta got up there, an NDP government, and went to bat for free trade principles more than all of the other provinces, except possibly Manitoba, since they weren't there. And Bush, you have your own theory as to why that happened.
Well, I think I mentioned it on the last episode that Brian Pallister seems to spend a lot of time out of the country, up to half of his time, including like getting injured in Mexico, to the point where he can't sign the bills his government is passing into law. Or sign executive orders. Sorry, he doesn't sign bills. But
you can't really take it one way or another, because it's not like Manitoba intervened on the side of Comeau.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you can take away from that, but I did find it Alberta's position interesting.
You didn't see Brad Wall coming out in support of it, despite that would be very on character with him.
That's true.
I did actually skim the factum from Saskatchewan, and they were complaining about the originalist interpretations of the Constitution that Comeau was trying to bring out, and that's why I brought that up earlier when you're pointing out the language is very simple and clear. Well, that's just using your originalism. What are you, Anton Scalia or Neil Gorsuch? We don't want that shit here.
This is a perfect segue into day two.
Okay.
So this is where the originalism arguments come up about what was really going on. I actually thought that counsel for Comeau started off really strong right off the bat, conceding that this was his position went against decades of Supreme Court of Canada jurisprudence, that in effect he was saying Gold Seal was decided wrong. In fact, he used the language that the baby was strangled in the crib. that from the get-go, the judges that were sitting on the court in 1921 had just gotten the answer wrong, and that 121 should extend to non-tariff barriers as well as tariff barriers. And I thought conceding that right off the bat, it really silenced a lot of questions from the court that would have been right away asking him, well, how does it fit with this judgment? Because he's saying we need a fresh start. This was incorrect, and we should have a new test as a result. And another really good point, as I mentioned before, a lot of the judges were asking questions about how could Section 121 be a dominant force over Sections 91 and 92, over the divisions of power. How can that be a trump card on the principles of federalism? And like I mentioned before, Comeau's counsel stands up there and gives a whole bunch of really good examples of when this happens. The Charter's the best example, right? This happens all the time. It's a constitutional provision. Okay? So if you have a law that runs against a constitutional provision, that cannot be allowed to operate. Now, it depends on your interpretation of Section 121. And this is where things started to get hairy, especially for Comeau's counsel, because he had a lot of difficulty, it seemed to me, meshing the ability for a province to regulate itself with Section 121. So how far can a province go in regulating its own
affairs? Its
own affairs,
economy almost.
And counsel for Comeau had a test, but Chief Justice McLaughlin said it best. She looked at the test, and it seemed like she was asking, how is this any different from the test that you have? And if it is different, you're probably not getting anywhere. Like, it doesn't match with your interpretation of free trade, because counsel for Comeau admitted that it was possible a province could continue to regulate the sale of alcohol and how much alcohol could be brought into the province under his own conception of a new test under Section 121. You can't satisfy judges that way. Like, if you're going to say that we need a fundamental break from jurisprudence, then you need to come up with a drastically different take. And some of the other interveners did try to come up and play with different sorts of tests that allowed for broad-based free trade. But I really didn't think Comeau's counsel got on that one. And he also had, I thought, a damaging exchange with Justice Brown, where, as I mentioned earlier, Justice Brown is really concerned, as is Justice Rowe. They're concerned about allowing value judgments to enter into the courtroom. And while they acknowledge that value judgments happen, this seems like an area where it's unnecessary. They reference the fact that all the provinces seem to have no problem with the way that the laws are currently set up. I mean, Alberta, sure, they want maybe a different test, but they're not on the side of Comeau. They're not arguing for what Comeau's arguing for. And he also brings up how certain things are as they stand, and whether it's more important for an individual to stand before a legislature and ask for change than it is before a judge and ask them to strike down a law. And why isn't it, Justice Brown asked, like, why isn't it that the provinces are affecting this change? Why are you coming to us to do this? Sorry, I'm putting words in his mouth. He didn't actually say those things, but that's what he's getting at. And I didn't see any great answer. I mean, Comeau's counsel says, well, what better place to ask these questions than in an impartial court? I'm sympathetic, like, as an aside, I'm very sympathetic to the causes of free trade, but that's not a great answer to that, to Justice Brown's question. Like, this really does seem to get at value issues, and Justice Brown said as much. He said when he goes into the LCBO, he's upset at how few space is given for British Columbia wines and how much space there's given for European wines. But still, he doesn't think that he should be in charge of whether or not that goes forward. That should be the responsibility of the people, capital T, capital P, to make those decisions.
Sure, and it's one thing when you're going into a court with a personal harm that you can show all the evidence for. That's what the Carter case was about. That was what the Bedford case was about. And you can say, look at what the effect of these laws, that political ineptitude or whatever, has left in place that are harming me and affronts to me. This guy's harm was, I can't get beer cheaper, which, I mean, we can make fun of, but it just doesn't rise to the same level of, like, fundamental injustice. There, on some levels, like, you can go back to the originalist interpretation of the Constitution and say, look, he should be able to do this. But within, the courts have given a framework that's unfortunate, but
if it runs against the Constitution, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. What Comeau's counsel is trying to say is the interpretation of the Constitution is wrong. You need a pretty good argument, I think, a pretty good public policy reason to change these things. And I think that this is what you're getting at, Bush, that the public policy reasons behind this, they're not so convincing. And I thought that there was something to be desired there. And it doesn't help when the Chief Justice of the court in her last case is saying, you're making me extremely confused and I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know how your test works. And Justice Moldaver was the most sympathetic, trying to help counsel's argument along. But even he started to have issues when counsel made that concession that a province could still enact valid regulations in the province to prohibit the sale of alcohol. I mean, he's just dealing with alcohol, but obviously this is going to extend to any product. The reason why this made news is because people feel very strongly about free trade, and cannabis culture had an intervener there, not really talking too much about the effects of alcohol sale prohibition, but how this is going to affect marijuana sales. And this goes above and beyond products that have values associated with them. We're talking about any product that you can think of and how those products are dealt with, from eggs to Sharpies. So by way of concluding remarks, very quickly, the judges had a really tough time with Comeau's arguments. I mean, they really gave him a hard run at this. And by the way that they were talking to the attorney generals of Canada and the assorted provinces, I can't see the trial judge's decision being upheld, let alone the decision in Gold Seal being altered. I mean, the judges are playing with the idea of maybe changing that test, but they do not see Section 121 in an originalist interpretation as Comeau's counsel did and as the trial judge in New Brunswick did.
Well, it almost sounds like they don't even see it at all as relevant. Like, it's just a vestigial clause, more or less.
Certainly two of the judges found it that way, and
it's the Third Amendment of Canadian Constitution.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was a concurring decision saying as much.
Do you get the sense from your time in arguing before judges and things that what they say to counsel in those kind of arguments actually reflects what they write?
This is a great question.
Because when I sat through the BC Court of Appeal on the Trinity Western hearings, I came out a little more optimistic than their devastating dismissal of
this is
Law
classic.
Society.
You can never, ever be sure. Never, ever be sure. You can, however, gauge the concerns of judges, and you can gauge the quality of answers of counsel. And if you give quality answers that may leave a judge pondering and considering, you have a chance. But if you leave a judge with an answer that's, not tight and doesn't satisfy the concern, or at least really address the concern, you're in for a rough ride. So look, there's no way of being certain, but the strongest measure of prediction is the kinds of questions that are put forward and the responses that are received.
So you don't think the lure of beer just across the Ottawa River, or cheaper beer across the Ottawa River, is going to sway the judges at all?
Judges get paid enough, at least Supreme Court judges.
Yeah, Justice Brown said that he was sympathetic and he was not happy about what was going on at the LCBO. But
I'm actually curious if any of them have ever bought a couple sits pats or something in Gatineau
in Quebec. Counsel for Comeau admitted that his people, I put that in quotation marks because I don't know who he meant by his people, go into Quebec often and bring the beer into Ottawa, which prompted Justice Brown to say, "So we're told," or "So we're told," which got a huge laugh out of the gallery, which also shows you just how nerdy and how nerdy everybody in that crowd is.
Well, the jokes at the TWU hearing was Bev's basement law school,
right?
Which is we're all still hoping for.
Yeah, this court, particularly in Chief Justice McLaughlin, former Chief Justice McLaughlin's last sitting period, has been seemingly more collegial than normal. Still respectful, but Justice Brown makes, like, he's more colloquial than most judges. I hesitate to say, like, they're very friendly and nice, because I don't want to give off that impression. That's not really what they're like. But they are certainly more friendly than most judges that I've experienced at that level, probably because everyone is so on their game when you get to the show.
So if it was Justice Micah sitting on that court, how would you be ruling on this one?
I'm like Justice Brown. I'm very sympathetic to the arguments that Comeau's counsel put forward, but that's because those are my values. It's because I believe in free trade and think that we should have the free flow of goods, that will help your average consumer. It seems to me like that's my decision to make at the ballot box, particularly after I've heard the arguments from on both sides and the questions of the judges. So short of what my fellow justices would say, I would probably overturn the decision in Comeau, and I would seek to change the gold seal test, but that would take some time to figure out how I would do that.
Well, you mentioned the collegial nature of the court, and maybe it's time to shift gears and just do a quick close on this segment by talking a bit about the changing nature of the court. Beverly McLaughlin, as you mentioned, stepped down as of a couple hours ago, I guess, and she's already doing interviews with the National. But before we get into that, maybe the new Chief Justice pick is Richard Wagner, as I heard Rosemary Barton say on CBC, or just Richard Wagner, as almost everyone else calls him. I don't know what his proper pronunciation is. What are your thoughts on Wagner as a Supreme Court Chief Justice pick?
If both of you gentlemen will recall, in a previous episode, and I can't remember which one it was.
Just go back and listen to them all.
Yeah, just go back and listen to them all. I described now Chief Justice Wagner as the betting money favorite. Smart, bilingual. He's Francophone, which would continue this not necessarily new, but more recent development of alternating between a Anglophone and Francophone judge. And he has the respect of his colleagues. And he's a consensus builder, according to insiders at the Supreme Court of Canada. My thoughts are that we are losing one of my favorite judges, someone who's helped shape the charter and whose shoes cannot be filled. Chief Justice Wagner will likely seek to continue the tradition of consensus building, so we don't have several concurring decisions, and potentially the collegial nature of the court, where they're not seeking to burn counsel that comes before it, but they're looking for an interchange of ideas where they address their concerns and they receive responses. So
you don't think his weird interview with the Globe and Mail following the TWU intervener decision overturn affected? Maybe that was like just a minor setback on his path to CJ? When legal commentators discuss Chief Justice Wagner, this seems to be a typical issue, an easy issue to highlight, because these things just don't seem to happen very often. And I don't know what... That's literally the first time a decision on who gets to intervene has been revised, and we're not even sure that was legal. But it's the court. No one's going to tell them it's not. It was the Chief Justice's decision to do that, and like, who's going to tell her no? Anyway, we won't relitigate the... I got to go to the Supreme Court. I'm not complaining. We won't relitigate the preposterous nature of what transpired during this Trinity Western intervener era. But here's what I will say. No, I don't think that in any way affects his ability to be a good Chief Justice, to be a good jurist. And here's a strong indication of why. Former Chief Justice McLaughlin came out and said Chief Justice Wagner is a great decision, and he's a great jurist, and he has the respect of his colleagues, and he's going to be a fantastic Chief Justice of Canada. And I have no reason to believe she would just come out and say that if she didn't really believe it. She could have just said nothing. I'm not sure if there's a precedent for Chief Justices to
to pat their former colleagues on the back. I mean, listen, one other thing I also want to throw out there is that it continues the tradition of prime ministers appointing Supreme Court of Canada judges to the seat of Chief Justice when those judges were in the first place appointed by a prime minister of the opposing party. So this is the third time we've seen this in a row. And I think that this is one indication that our Supreme Court of Canada truly is nonpartisan. Namely because we don't have prime ministers appointing friendly judges, let's call them, to that seat. They're really picking the judge that should be in that chair, or at least the judge that the betting money is on should be in that chair.
Well, maybe just my last question is, what are your thoughts on the, at least CBC article put up a teaser of Beverly McLaughlin's interview with The National, where she goes into how she felt like when Harper tried to push Nadon onto the court, and then there was this weird back and forth at the time where he said he called her, or she was calling him, and they were arguing, and she just like kind of went silent. But now she's just spilling all the beans, and like, I was so pissed, and he was trying to undermine the court, and I was worried about the like irreparable harm to the justice system. What are your thoughts on Beverly McLaughlin untethered?
I love it. I mean, I think former Chief Justice McLaughlin is the best. I'm a huge fan of hers. I don't understand to this day why the Conservative government or former Prime Minister Harper went after the Supreme Court of Canada and the Chief Justice like that. You have one separate branch of government criticizing another that's supposed to be impartial and can't defend itself. Now, then Chief Justice McLaughlin put out a news release, I think, discussing her version of the facts, but she didn't come back and say, the Prime Minister should apologize and he's wrong for doing this. She just put out her version of the facts. Here's what happened. And a lot of lawyers were very upset with the Conservative government at the time for doing that, because it does undermine the integrity of the court when you have the most powerful political entity in Canada making allegations that the Chief Justice, the head of the court, was engaging in political dealings, was trying to influence the decision of the Prime Minister. If that was true, I want to choose my words carefully. I mean, that would be the news story of the year. I think that, if the roles were reversed, right? If a politician was trying to influence a court decision by calling the Chief Justice, think about how serious that is. So it should give you an idea as to how serious the allegations are. This is a very long-winded way of saying that I felt like Harper was very much in the wrong. There's a lot of things to be critical about, but this was something that, to my mind, is simply not defensible. And the International College of Jurists, I forget what the name of the organization is. I mean, they demanded an apology be rendered as a result of this, just because of how important it is that our courts be seen to be doing justice and be completely impartial.
Well, thanks again for that.
To those of you who stuck it out, my sincere congratulations. Listening to me ramble on about trade barriers, well done.
No, I think it was great.
Yeah,
I enjoyed it.
And we look forward to the results of the Comeau case.
Thank you both very much for having me back on the program.
Thank you.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Well, moving on to quick takes. The one thing I want to mention really quickly, since we have a lawyer in the room, I don't know if you saw this, Micah, but the Justice Department published what they're calling Charterpedia, which is the Human Rights Internal Division's, their own analyses and take on the jurisprudence coming out of the Supreme Court of Canada on every section of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so I don't really have any political things to say about this other than it's awesome for someone who like dabbles in pretend law like me, that I can just go through and have well-written, well-researched, not opinionated, just basically here's what at least the government of Canada understands the law to be on Section 2A, on Section 7.
You know who's rejoicing? Law students everywhere.
There we go. I think it's actually really, besides just the utility of it, it's actually a good sign from the government to show the transparency. And it's something I think they've been working on. At least that's how they justify it. They said, we started this division right after the charter came in. And then eventually we developed a checklist of just like how we make sure laws match the charter. And now they've basically just published the checklist.
It makes sense. As we discussed earlier, words are one thing, but the interpretation can be something completely different. It's a good idea to make Canadians aware of what their rights are. It's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The layperson should know what those are, and providing the interpretations of those sections, they're important.
The government actually gives out free copies of the Charter on Rights and Freedoms as posters that you can just order, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. You can also get the Bill of Rights if you're interested.
For the Diefenbaker fans out there.
the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights.
I think that you need to explain why you want a copy of the Charter.
No, I got one. I just filled out the form.
Without putting out any reason. Because I got a copy and I told them I was going to put it in my office.
Well, mine right now is getting framed, and so it'll be hanging on the wall maybe by Christmas or in the early new year. But I'll put a link to that because everyone should order their free thing. When the government gives you free things, like Scott's on the list to get a flag, but that's going to take 60 years, right?
I think it's down to 58 now.
Okay.
I'll be in my, I think, 70s or so.
Make sure you put that in your will, just in case.
Actually, that's a good question. Is it transferable upon death? So
I hope you read that in your contract when you applied to the lottery for this flag.
That's not a lottery, it's just a wait list.
Oh, it is just a wait list.
Yeah. Yeah, so not only that, you can also get pictures of the Queen, which I'm sure our small R Republican here is also on the list for.
I am not.
So CBC's taking some heat because they just fired Richard Zussman, the BC legislature reporter for them, for writing a book about the BC legislature. And, well, I think basically everyone has come out, including the Premier, calling out CBC for this and basically going, what the fuck?
So Zussman's not commenting publicly on this because he's in a labor dispute over the firing. It sounds like CBC has some internal policies that if you want to do a third-party project, you have to get the go-ahead. So Richard Zussman can't comment. He's appealing the decision, hoping to get his job back, but he's got to keep mum. So what we're getting out is mostly rumors and the sources, whoever those might be, close to the issue in CBC. As you say, John Horgan was screaming at the CBC, which is not something politicians in Canada generally do who aren't conservative, but then it's just a existential thing, not a specific HR thing. Zussman's decision to write this book, it seems like he missed getting the proper approvals, but at the same time, a book by Richard Zussman and Rob Shaw, who's also a pretty reputable journalist here in BC, on the BC election that was just controversial, only benefits the establishments they work for. They get a better profile.
So yeah, from the sounds of it, he basically he ran it by his immediate supervisor, but it didn't get run up the flagpole quite high enough, which is technically out of line with their internal policies on this. But it's one of those sorts of things where it just seems incredibly disproportionate to fire someone over this. Write a sternly worded letter to his file or something, or suspend him for a week or two. So just something like that rather than firing him.
These are the kind of stories where I feel like there's a side we're missing, except in this one, I've kept looking, and other than he didn't check all the boxes, there is no other side. So hopefully this gets sorted out, because Zussman is one of the good guys, and there's not enough people covering BC politics. That's why we started this podcast. So we'll keep an eye on that, because that's a really random thing to have happened. Well, at the federal level, Bill Morneau has a bit of overdue good news for him, as he managed to reach a deal with the provinces on the cannabis tax revenue. This had been a source of some contention as the provinces said, we're going to be doing all of the work, so we would like most of the money. And I think the federal government's first bid was 50-50. Well, it's come down now that the provinces are going to get 75%, and the federal government will get up to $100 million of the rest, and then the provinces can just do with as they will. And they've also pegged the price of legal cannabis at $10 a gram, which I'm pretty sure no one in this room has any price point to judge by whether that's good or bad. I think I did Google the other day what like the street prices are, because that's the kind of person I am, and it's about average, depending where you are. Although apparently buying weed's really weird because sometimes it's in ounces, sometimes grams, sometimes, I don't know, kilograms. But then you're getting into some questionable territory.
Yeah, you see, this is why it needs to be legalized. You can standardize the units on it.
That's the exact reason.
Scott is an metric system aficionado at the end of the day.
I think aficionado might be underselling it.
So it's interesting that the federal government pegged that $100 million cap on an estimate that the first year they will only have $400 million in tax revenue. I know a lot of the cannabis activists were talking about billions of dollars of revenue that was available, but no one has really put a number on that before this.
Yeah, it's billion seems completely insane as an estimate, and if you take the few places in the States and kind of do a very simple, just scale it off population, it comes to nowhere near billions.
And the other thing to note here is the federal government says they're going to be spending at least $700 million a year just to get their cannabis program and public health and safety programs related to that off the ground. So spending far more on the program than actually expecting to make. Quebec is saying the same thing. They're hoping to take in 60 million, but expecting to spend tons and tons more. I know municipalities are still frustrated because a lot of them are saying we're the ones going to have to be dealing with the very front lines, and some are framing it as a police issue, but then you're also
zoning complaints too.
Zoning complaints. And
yeah,
the police issue I find a bit egregious because you're like, the point of making it legal was supposed to be to reduce policing costs, but now cops are like, no, the law is changing, so we need a lot more money. Maybe I'm just like being a little anti-cop here, but that's a pretty specious argument in my view. Whenever any law changes, I can imagine everyone comes hat in hand to the government saying, I need more money now, obviously, even if your current expenses are being eliminated.
Yeah, I can see some like retraining costs and whatnot, but as an ongoing expense, it seems weird.
Well, I guess some things still remain illegal, and there will be these new roadside intoxicated driving offenses, which we haven't figured out how we're going to deal with, but they will be illegal, so we'll have to buy magic kits.
They already are illegal, right?
Yeah.
They will remain illegal, and we still need to find a good way to deal with that.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
This is
I think right now it might be by blood test. I could be way off the base because I don't deal with these things, and I know that there are various companies trying to figure out how you can do a sort of breathalyzer. But to my mind, at the moment, that's not possible. Obviously, it's possible to determine whether or not somebody's under the influence of a drug just by looking at them, but that might not be sufficient for some kind of criminal or quasi-criminal charge.
This is the kind of area I think is ripe for pseudoscientific nonsense to really move in. One story that came out of the UK when I was living there and working for a science charity was there was a contractor that got a pretty big contract from the government to actually sell them dowsing rods to do bomb detection. Well, and it actually turns out that a bunch of utilities companies in the UK and even here in Canada are still using water dowsing to figure out where water lines are. And it's not always their main one. I made fun of this on Twitter or Facebook one day, and I had people coming forward to say, oh no, I believe in science and everything, but this, I've seen it work. I'm like, no, that's not how science works. But that's just an aside. We're going to see all kinds of crap testing come out for this. People are going to get taken advantage of, but at least middle-class white people will be able to buy their weed for $10 a gram at the BC cannabis store.
you can get it at your local BC liquor store or perhaps your local dispensary, but not from New Brunswick.
Well, and speaking of federal financial boondoggles, the federal government is under fire for having a, quote, naughty and nice list of defense contractors as they've rolled out their announcement of how we're going to replace the F-18s. So maybe I'll just throw this over to you, Scott, to rant for like 2 minutes.
Yeah, so the government formally announced they are in fact going ahead with the near identical fighters we already have just from down under. And now that's official rather than just rumored like it was last week. And they're also going ahead with a new competition to find out what we're going to be replacing them with in a few years' time, being sometime around 2030 probably.
It's just a stopgap, right?
Yeah, the stopgap that seems to continually push the deadline forward. I remember when I was a teenager looking at getting into the military, I was like, okay, I want to do the fighter pilot thing. Like, I'm colorblind, so I can't. But like, I was like, okay, 2017, that's when we're getting the new fighters. I'd be a captain then, would be great, like just at the right spot. And no, we don't even have the stopgap yet.
Wait, Scott, you're colorblind? What color is this?
Scott is also has been not a teenager for like 8 years, so take that with a grain of salt.
The point is, this has been a while, and it's getting dragged out even longer as they're finally restarting the competition that was kind of already in process when they took over and kind of... Anyway, the long and the short of it, though, is they're adding in some interesting new terms here where they're going to look at kind of the overall perspective of what the company is going to be doing for Canada and whether they're kind of harm or hurt the Canadian economy and national interests, i.e., are they in a trade dispute with Bombardier?
I think there's also some talk of having a bit more of a look at jobs and ensuring there's a benefit to the Canadian worker, which matches Trudeau's rhetoric around trade deals, where when he's in China, well, let's exclude China because he got laughed out of the country there. Well, he got laughed at when he was in the country there. But when he's working on the TPP or what he's talking about in NAFTA is he wants to make sure progressive Canadian values, but not Canadian values because that's a tainted term, progressive values are brought into the trade deal. And even here in British Columbia, John Horgan's approach to big contracts is not the race to the bottom anymore. He's saying we're going to bring union projects back in because we want to make sure that when the government, which has a decision to make about who we hire, we want to make sure we take care of people because that's why he got elected.
Making a value choice there.
Yeah, and it means we end up spending more, or maybe it means we get shittier planes, but they were built by unions.
We're making the right decisions, by the way. I'm putting right in quotation marks.
Yeah, and this is the reason we spend $10 billion every 30 years to rebuild a shipyard to build new ships rather than buying them from a company that's already making ships. And, you know, it's great in theory if you completely ignore opportunity costs or kind of the quality of the kit we're getting. And yeah, this has been kind of a long-standing problem with defense procurement of trying to turn it into a jobs program. But
everywhere in Canadian government. Just look at Bombardier. It's everywhere in Canadian government.
Yeah, just be glad they don't have a fighter program. That's all I'm saying.
They're getting closer.
Actually,
they're creeping towards one.
When I was thinking about this, I was like, we're going to get a Avro Arrow 2, aren't we? We're going to spend like 10 years developing the best fighter ever. Then we're going to realize we don't actually need a fighter. It's the era of drones, and the next conservative government is going to kill it, being like, and then 20 years down the line, there'll be another CBC documentary, bleary-eyed looking at the past of like, imagine the Avro Arrow 2 that would have like been the coolest Canadian jet that was a total waste of money and time and not actually necessary. But we would have been the best at the thing no one else needed to do.
Yeah, like I said, long-standing thing. The main difference here, though, is they're kind of adding a layer on top of that where it's not just, hey, is there some benefit to the Canadian economy, but kind of the overall impacts and whether or not a bidder is, quote-unquote, responsible for harming Canadian economic interests, and they will be at a distinct disadvantage compared to other bidders. So it's basically now where they're looking at if you're kind of involved in any other dispute with a Canadian company, you're potentially going to lose a contract over it. And that's raised some concerns about international trade law and a whole bunch of other stuff like that, and whether or not we can even really legally do this, or whether it's a good idea.
But are the F-35 still banned from the list, or has Justin Trudeau gone back on that promise?
That got walked back fairly early on, but they've been taking their time on this, so I think people forget about that by the time it finally gets announced. Because, we're almost certainly going to be buying the 35s at some point.
Well, following up on last week, and I guess taking a look at how well each of the parties are doing, on Monday we had 4 federal by-elections. The most interesting was right here in our backyard in South Surrey, White Rock. But starting at the far end of the country, in Newfoundland, the riding of Bonavista Burin Trinity was won by Terence Rogers of the Liberals, but this time he only got 69% of the vote instead of the, I think, 81% of the vote they got in the last election. I mean, at that level, you can't really say the Liberals' fortunes have declined because they're still getting an absurd gap for, a 30-point gap over the next person.
Yeah, but the trend line is negative, so sometime around the 2040s, watch out.
Meanwhile, in Scarborough Agincourt, the Liberal candidate there won with 49% of the vote over the Conservatives with 40.5%. It was also a pretty strong Liberal riding. If things had gone perfectly for Scheer, he might have had a chance there, but he didn't. Rosemary Falk in Battleford's Lloydsminster, the Conservative, won that with 61%, which it's Saskatchewan, rural Saskatchewan. A Conservative was guaranteed to win there. That was interestingly the only riding where the NDP placed second at 13.2%. Also the only riding they got over 10% of the vote in this by-election. And here in South Surrey, White Rock, Gordie Hogg for the Liberals, as I called, got 47.5% over Carrie Lynn Findlay from the Conservatives, 42%, which I think is both part of the Liberals being a bit stronger in the polls in BC and just Hogg's name recognition. He was a BC Liberal MLA there for a long time, and before that he was the White Rock mayor for a long time and seemed relatively popular. People didn't hate him, so they saw he was on the list and showed up to vote for him. In terms of turnout, it interestingly also, not really interestingly, also increases as you go west across the country.
By-elections here.
It's like 21% of people showed up in Newfoundland, 27% in Saskatchewan and Ontario, but BC's election there in Surrey had 38% of the people show up, which is actually pretty good for a by-election where you almost usually never get above 25% or 26%.
I think that speaks to the Liberals campaigning. I think that's good campaigning from the federal Liberals. And it speaks volumes. Usually, and we saw this in the Vancouver municipal by-election, usually by-elections serve as an occasion for voters to take it out on the ruling government, say they're not doing well enough. I think David Moscrop on his last appearance with you two boys, he was saying that, you can read any narrative you want into a by-election, and I, to a certain extent, agree with that. But I still think it's noteworthy that you have less than 50% and the incumbent government is picking up seats. To me, that's impressive.
Well, it's what 538 says a lot about the special elections and all these interim elections in the US is each one, like the Doug Jones victory on its own doesn't show anything. But when you look at all of the other places where Democrats are doing much better, that's when you start to build a narrative. And in Canada, we had a by-election or a couple by-elections a few months ago, and the Liberals picked up a seat in Quebec, and they've held every seat. So the only seats they're not getting are the ones they have no chance in.
Yeah, and that's what I think's most interesting about this is the second seat that's flipped from Conservative to Liberal since Andrew Scheer's become leader, and it's not a great sign for them if they can't even hold seats against an incumbent government in a by-election.
The other storyline here is that Jagmeet Singh wasn't on the map. None of these ridings were expected to be NDP pickups or even places where they could really turn out a great vote, but South Surrey is getting into the range where I think Singh wants to start building the ethnic NDP vote if we want to go there. And maybe even Scarborough to start picking up. But the fact he got a handful of percent, 5-6% in Scarborough is trivial. So he can get away with it for a little bit longer. I think he's only been leader for a few months and he's still doing his cross-country tour, talking to local media. But at some point, you do have to focus on winning elections, or else what are you doing?
Yeah, and in the case of South Surrey, White Rock, the vote share fell from 10.4% down to basically 5%, 4.9%. And it's not a great sign when the NDP's losing vote share when they have a new leader. And the fact that both major opposition parties are losing vote shares is pretty comforting to Trudeau and should be worrying the back rooms of both the Conservatives and the NDP. So from a follow-up from last week, Canada's stupidest trade war is continuing as it escalated as Saskatchewan has now extended its license plate ban from road projects to all work sites in the province.
Initially, Saskatchewan, as we mentioned last week, said no new work sites would allow Alberta license plates on
road projects,
on trucks or whatever that shows up. And now it's just all of them. What's interesting, though, is this is news coming out of Darren Billou's, the Alberta Economic Development Minister. He's saying that the highways minister in Saskatchewan is requiring everyone to register. And it's just a weird back and forth of who's requiring what. And he said, she said type nonsense.
Non-tariff trade barriers, boys.
Yeah, so would this actually be one of the few ones that wouldn't, where 121 would kick in? But,
no, right? Because they're regulating things that go on within their own boundaries. Essence and purpose. Although, I suppose the purpose is to protect their own construction industry.
Well, I think the purpose is being petty.
Well, and what I love about this CBC article is it just ends by saying Saskatchewan didn't call Alberta before or after announcing the ban. And it's just like, oh, they're not even talking to me anymore. And it's not even easy to figure out who's saying what anymore. It's just like it's escalating, but it's not clear why. Other than it's in everyone's political interest.
Oh, yeah. No,
and the media is like loving it because it's hilarious and stupid.
Yeah, this is just blatant politics. And there's barely even a cover or an attempt at providing a purpose and rationale for this one beyond, screw those Albertans.
I think it makes people who live in Saskatchewan feel good. Like their government's doing something to keep their jobs at home.
Well, and it's the same in Alberta.
It's not even
they love trade battles.
It's not even keeping their jobs. It's just making someone change the registration on their vehicle.
I love, though, on Wednesday, and I don't think any follow-up had happened from this, but Billu was saying it's trade non-compliant. They have until midnight tonight to smarten up, come to their senses, and walk this back. He's throwing, ultimatum threats down. And I know they talked about filing a lawsuit, but
they could just, they could just ticket them, right? They could just start handing out fines, which is usually how these things are done.
You're saying Alberta should be handing out fines to Saskatchewan plates that come into town?
Or
just whatever?
What do you want to do? Do you want to one up? Do you want to start fueling the fire? Because if you do, you start handing out fines and tickets. To anybody, not even people who are doing construction. It's just an all-out trade war between two provinces for no reason.
Alberta has the rat patrol. There are no rats in Alberta. They have a task force that runs around and makes sure rats don't cross in. This exists. This is a real thing. They could, I'm sure, redeploy the anti-rat crew to be the anti-Saskatchewan crew. And they could even lean into it, be like, come on, they're rats anyway, right?
Oh, Jesus. Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Well, and finally, here in Vancouver, Hector Bremner's been making some headways as he announced a motion to pretty much blanket rezone Vancouver's Point Grey, one of the West End neighborhoods nearby here, right up against UBC, to allow up to 6-story mansions over top of all of the giant homes, but directed mostly at purpose-built rentals for seniors, low income, and students.
Yeah, so this is Northwest Point Grey, which is a tiny little corner in, well, the northwest corner of the broader Point Grey area. And right now, yeah, it's basically zoned to only allow mansions. Massive lots, and only build houses on there. It's, yeah, a football field-sized lot, so it's in the already unaffordable market. It's just way outside of what anyone who's not crazy rich can afford, and this is literally right beside UBC, and the motion was to allow sit-story rentals in this area, and yeah, also keep the existing zone, and people can still build mansions if they want, but yeah, now you can put up a sit-story rental or a senior's home, or you would if it had ended up going anywhere, which it kind of got buried and shuffled off to staff to, maybe look at eventually, and we might see a report a year from now.
It was interesting seeing the back and forth over this. The motion itself, I can't see any reason to oppose it other than I'm just like, I don't trust Hector. We had him on the show and that was an interesting interview, but there's still something that leaves me a little uneasy. And I like the focus here on affordable rentals for people who need them. But then the media coverage was also pointing out this is the guy who voted against the housing reset that maybe not have been perfect, but was still, I think, as we discussed, a step forward for the city.
Yeah, there is for sure an element of playing politics and this being a bit of a political stunt for sure. And that's the thing is, we just got that housing reset passed and Bremner voted against it on it doesn't go far enough, this isn't, good enough, all of that stuff. And then it follows up with okay, you say in your thing you want to transform low density neighborhoods, well, let's do it. Here's an actual proposal. Are you serious about it? And yeah, that was the play, is to make Vision look bad for not following through on their big housing strategy.
I can imagine that in that area, so correct me if I'm wrong, but that includes the houses of people like Chip Wilson, who
yes,
Jean Swanson marched on with her banner, and we need to tax him this exact amount. Here's your bill. Hilarious. And I think David Suzuki lives along there as well, and a number of others. This wouldn't force them out of their houses and force them to build apartments, but it would say, if you sell your home, an apartment builder could buy it and tear it down and build apartments there.
Yeah, well, hell, the lots are so big, they could keep the mansion and just build 2 apartment buildings on either side of it. And, I'm fine with Jeff Wilson keeping his mansion. I just want to see it surrounded by apartments.
I'm just thinking a lot of the major donors for, realistically, probably both the NPA and Vision live in that area because it's where the richest people in the province live. So whether that has any effect, it's still encouraging to see that come from Bremner. Probably both parties are realizing their days of big corporate financing are over with the province's new laws, and even individual donations are fixed. So
yeah, and there's 400-ish people who live there, so it's at $1,500 each, a limit. That's not a huge amount of foregone fundraising.
It's 400 people who are very effective at keeping a useful seawall being built along that area as well. So they're not to be dismissed. They clearly have political clout, but yeah, interesting play from Bremner.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, and I'm a little disappointed it didn't pass. I mean, I think it's actually a pretty good set of ideas in there, and yeah.
I think most Vancouverites are generally pro-building. They want to see more development.
Just not in their neighborhood.
Sorry?
Just not right beside them.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. So Bremner comes out and he says, let's start building more homes. I think he has some sympathy with people, although like Bush, they probably feel like, okay, what nefarious political purpose is going on here? And even if that is the case, I mean, Vancouver needs more homes. So putting aside whatever cloudy judgment is going on here, if that is really the case, this is something that should probably go forward. The more housing, the better in the city.
Yeah,
and you can't gentrify West Point Grey because it is the gentry.
Yeah.
It is the gentriest of the gentry.
There was even a line in the preamble on it this is a zero displacement rezoning or something like that. part of the reason it was done this way was that this is basically Vancouver's worst zoning. So they'd say, this is the least sympathetic group of people. So if you're going to do a test case, this is the test case you want to use, which is crazy exclusionary policies right beside UBC and force a bunch of poor students to commute an hour a day. It's the perfect test case for this is how bad we're doing land use here. Let's change it.
Scott is trying to find a way to squeeze the 99B into this discussion so that he can Stephen Carter it.
The 99B got... the subway got mentioned quite a bit in the press coverage of this. It just doesn't make sense to spend $4 billion building a subway to shuttle people in when you could just let them live where they want to live. And that has been PolitiCoast. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicoast.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitiCoastPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/PolitiCoast. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.